Well, good morning. My name is Mark Ray. I'm Executive Director of Grace Center for Spiritual Development. I want to welcome you to Grace Cafe this morning. We've got a very special guest, Garry Kiker, good friend, longtime friend. I'll get to Garry in just a minute, but while we're hanging out here, let me invite you to log on to Facebook, be a part of this Grace Cafe interview today. You can send in questions. You can have conversation with us. We'd also like you to share it with your neighbors, your friends, your relatives. This is going to be a conversation that you're going to want to be a part of. I want to welcome Garry Kiker, sitting there with his favorite cup of tea. I've got my favorite cup of coffee and my Grace Cafe mug. Little product plug there. So go grab your favorite cup of tea. Come back and join us. While you're doing that, let me give a little bit of background on Garry. Graduated with his master's in educational psychology from Texas A&M. He is a licensed professional counselor, a fellow in the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapists. He's worked for Campus Crusade. He's worked in the oil patch. He has worked with RAFA, which is, I didn't know that about you, Garry. He worked with RAFA, which is an inpatient psychiatric and substance abuse program, dealing with those issues from a Christian perspective. He had his own private practice. He is an adjunct at Grace School of Theology. He is a speaker. He is a teacher. He is a counselor. He is a skier. He is a painter. This is, Garry, you sound like a Renaissance man there. You cover a lot of ground. Plus, better part of him is he's married to his wonderful wife, Sandra. So welcome. We are glad you're here, Garry. We're going to launch into in just a moment, as everybody kind of gets settled back in, a topic that I think has incredible relevance for today. You read in the newspapers more and more and more about conflict between politicians, conflict between people, conflict between sides of religion, sides of politics, conflict with your neighbors, with your coworkers. And Jesus was no stranger to conflict either. He was in the middle of conflict because of what he taught. And you teach, you'll be teaching in the fall here, a course at Grace School of Theology on conflict resolution. You do seminars on conflict resolution. So if you don't mind, I want to hone in on that topic for today. Like I said, I think it's relevant for today. So first of all, let me just ask you, as a byproduct of conflict resolution in the seminar you teach, open the door for us on who would benefit from taking a course or going to a seminar on conflict resolution. Who would benefit from this?
Well, basically, anybody who's engaged in conflict. We think about Christian organizations, and we think Christian organizations of all people should know how to handle conflict. And yet, some of the most dysfunctional systems I've seen have been in the Christian world. So basically, the fundamental principles that are needed are good for everybody.
So what you're basically saying is if I'm a pastor, I obviously am going to be engaged in conflict. If I'm a spouse,
typically,
there's going to be conflict. If I'm a worker, there's going to be conflict. If I'm a parent, there's going to be conflict. If I'm a neighbor,
right,
there's going to be conflict. What I hear you saying is the principles that we're going to talk about in just a moment, the principles of conflict resolution really are universal. They're going to apply to anybody because everybody's going to experience conflict in one way or another. Am I correct?
Absolutely. In Job, it says, man is to troubles as the sparks fly upward. I mean, have you ever sat by a campfire? You watch the sparks go up and they kind of disappear, and what's right behind them? More sparks. So conflict is inevitable. In fact, the irony of a relationship is the closer you get to someone, the more likely they are to step on your toes, and the worse it feels. And I'm not concerned about what the person that I don't know says about me, but the people I care about. In those situations where we're at conflict, it's even more important to resolve and to know how to resolve. But I ask people all the time, how did your parents resolve conflict? And they say,
Yeah.
I don't know, or they didn't. The number
Yeah.
one answer these days is they got a divorce, which is tragic and very sad.
Yeah, I grew up in a family in which my parents made the conscious decision that they did not want their children to ever see them, quote unquote, fight. My parents had a marvelous marriage, and no doubt had conflict. They were both very strong personality people, but they made a conscious decision not to show that in front of the kids. Therefore, you never learned how to, as a
Right,
child growing up, life was happy.
right.
So, my first couple of months of marriage to my marvelous wife, Melissa, we had conflict and I thought the marriage was over because I'd never really seen conflict resolved. Thankfully, she was patient enough with me we now have learned how to resolve conflict. But, so Garry, walk us
That's not an
through.
uncommon response, Bob.
Yeah.
That's not an uncommon
Yeah.
situation. Sandra
Well,
and
it's
I
not.
took the exact opposite. Sandra and I took the exact opposite approach.
Yeah.
We had our conflict, didn't matter where, but we always talked to the kids about how we worked through it, you know.
Yeah.
And
That's a good thing.
we said, well, we saw it as a teaching opportunity. Besides, I wasn't quite disciplined enough to retain myself in some situations. So we
Well, the
strained
beauty of it
ourselves.
is you're still married, I'm still married, so it's been a long
Right.
time. I think we're both blessed with
43
incredible
years.
wives. So yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
So walk me through maybe the top three, and I know we can't dive deeply. It's a 6 or a 7 hour seminar, and it's a full course that you teach at the seminary on this. But walk me through maybe the top three principles that you teach on biblical principles that you teach on conflict resolution. What would be the overarching principle, if there is one, to resolving conflict?
Well, the first thing is that you have to realize that conflict resolution starts with you. We're
I knew you were going
commanded
to
to
say
reach
that.
out to people. No, not you. I mean, me, us, the global you.
The individual.
That
Yeah,
we're under obligation as Christians to be obedient and live the Christian life and do the things that the Bible says in terms of restoring relationships or attempting to restore
yeah,
relationships or dealing with bitterness and that type of thing. And what I see a lot of times that I consider the biggest obstacle in trying to resolve conflict is a dynamic that is referred to as blaming, where I see my behaviors as a result of what somebody else did, and therefore I justify them. But if you call me a jerk and I
yeah,
call you a jerk back, who owes who an apology,
yeah. So
right?
you're the
We
reason.
both,
You're the reason I'm acting this way.
right? But if you're responsible for my behavior, I can't get healthy until you get healthy, which puts me in an awkward
Yeah,
position when it comes to be obedient to God. So that's a big obstacle. In fact, one of the things I tell people a lot is that there are two things that are absolutely necessary for a long-term relationship. One is a willingness to take personal responsibility, and the other is compassion. Compassion being how you feel toward people who do it wrong.
yeah.
People who do it right,
That's
they might
interesting.
need support, they might need help, but they don't need compassion. I mean, Jesus looked out on the multitudes and he said he was moved with compassion because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus had compassion on people who didn't know what they were doing and,
Yeah,
and, and weren't doing it right. And so, as it turns out, if you have those two things working in a relationship, you've got a relationship building dynamic where I take responsibility, you meet it with compassion, um, you know, and because it's a lot easier to have compassion on people who are taking responsibility.
yeah.
And it's a lot
Great
easier
point.
to take responsibility if you know it's going to be met with compassion and not judgment and condemnation.
Well, and
That
especially in a close relationship, if you're willing to take responsibility, it's much easier for the other person then to see that acquiescence that I'm taking upon myself. This is my fault. This is,
right.
and I don't want to say I'm blaming myself, but I'm really saying to you, that was not a result of you. That was a result of me, and that one's on me.
Well, my behaviors are
Yeah,
always a result of me. They might be influenced by other factors, but it comes down to me making a choice.
you just keep
So I can't
convicting
say,
me here.
I wouldn't have called you a jerk if you hadn't called me a jerk. Right? I can't say
Yeah,
that.
yeah. There you go.
I've got to say, you know what? Before God, I did something wrong,
Yeah,
and that's where we live our lives is before God, not before men.
yeah.
So, so that would be one big thing for people to understand is it starts with a willingness to own your own problems and look at other people's problems with compassion and not judgment and condemnation. In fact, I heard
It,
Adrian Rogers say one day that the Christian world would be a better place if people would replace um, uh, criticism with confession and
huh,
condemnation with compassion. And
wow,
I thought that
that's
that
pretty
really
powerful.
reached, yeah, right.
Yeah, very convicting. So in your family practice, in your marriage and counseling practice, is that though that's what I'm hearing you say is one of the high level principles that you got to get through. Is that one of the toughest principles for a person
It
to
is.
actually say, I'm willing, I see it, and I'm willing to take that responsibility? Is that a
It
tough thing to
is. In
get people to
fact,
see and to do?
right. It's one of the things that has to happen for, a marriage to thrive.
Yeah.
Um, if I can't come to you and say, what you did hurt my feelings and not hear, well, I wouldn't have done that to you if you hadn't have done that to me, or, I was having
That'll
a
shut it
bad
down quick.
day, or
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
then the relationship begins to be feel unsafe. And when a relationship starts to feel unsafe, we stop thinking about growth, which is what God
Yeah.
wants us to do in a marriage, and we start trying to survive. And none of us looks very good in survival mode. Drowning people drown the lifeguard. So,
Well,
really, yeah,
the interesting thing is that taking responsibility, you can go all the way back to the garden to Adam when God basically looks at Adam and Adam basically blames God first. So the
right.
blame game started all the way back in the Garden of Eden
It
where Adam
absolutely
said,
did.
God, you're the one that gave me the woman. First of all, it's your fault for giving me the woman. Second of all, it's her fault for offering me the fruit, never taking the responsibility for the fact that he actually miscommunicated God's command first. And second, he sat there and took the fruit. Um, I mean, that's a practice that goes all the way back to the very first humans in that relationship, and
But
blaming
believe me,
God in that relationship.
it's
Yeah.
still alive and well. So, uh, the second thing that I would say is kind of an overarching principle is there are really only two kinds of conflict, which when you think about it is kind of amazing. Out of all the conflict that is out there, it boils down to two different types: um, disagreement and offense. Now, some people are offended that you disagree with them. Well, uh, people get to
And
disagree.
then you got them both. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you get to disagree, so it's kind of unfair to be offended that somebody disagrees with you. I mean, God lets us
Yeah.
disagree with Him if we're willing to face the consequences.
Yeah.
But so disagreement is a normal, natural part of life. But some people disagree in a way that's offensive. Like, why do you think that? That's stupid, you know? So,
Yeah.
so you've just compounded the problem. But it basically boils down to those two things. And it's important to know what kind of conflict you're in because the way out of each is different. Um,
Oh, that's fascinating.
so, yeah. Now, when again you look at it, there are two kinds of disagreements. There's disagreements that you can negotiate, and there are disagreements about beliefs and values, which you typically can't negotiate. But the thing you have to negotiate when you have a disagreement in beliefs and values is what's our relationship going to look like under those
Yeah.
circumstances? Because those particular things aren't likely to change. You know, if we're disagreeing about how much housework I should do and things like that, we can negotiate those things. But We can't negotiate our beliefs and values, but we have to
Yeah.
negotiate how our relationship is going to coexist. So, you know, I told that to a guy one time, and he looked at me and said, "No, Gary, there's a third kind of conflict." I said, "What's that?" He said, "Miscommunication." And I said, "Really?" I said, "Well, miscommunication is a disagreement about what was said that usually results in somebody being offended. Miscommunication, misunderstanding
Yeah.
is a way you get into conflict, but
Yeah.
it's not in itself a type of conflict. It's kind of a cause of conflict. But the
So
thing about miscommunication, people say, well, I just misunderstood you, like it's an excuse. I might have
yeah.
misunderstood you, but the way I acted is something I need to take responsibility for.
Yeah. So what are you going to do about that? Yeah. So if
Right,
there's a
right.
miscommunication and there's offense, who's going to stand up and take the first responsibility that says, my apologies for that, and let's reconcile that. Let's correct that. What do you do? Just sideline question here, but what do you do with a passage where Jesus basically says, "My message will be an offense. It will be a scandalon. It will be my message is going to potentially separate family members. It's going to separate friends, some that are going to believe and some that aren't going to believe, and we certainly see that today. How
Well,
how does that
it's
play into that? And maybe that's a whole nother topic we need to do at another
no,
time.
no. What you raise is a very complicated question, but the
Yeah,
bottom line is, when do we attempt to resolve an offense, right?
yeah,
And if you're offended by me sharing the gospel the way the Pharisees were when Peter shared the gospel, I'm sorry, you're just going to have to be offended. If that's an offense to you, I'm not going to own that as a bad behavior. Should I obey God rather than men? And so there are some offenses that rise out of beliefs and values
right.
that uh, you know I'm not going to deal with.
It still doesn't
So
mean we can't be gracious in our approach.
oh
And
yeah,
um,
I don't
yeah,
think Peter was
okay.
very gracious though when he said, "Jesus, whom you crucified." I mean, it's pretty
Well,
straightforward, right?
true, true.
No
Well,
mincing of
that's
words
that's
there.
a that's a whole other topic. So
Right.
where does forgiveness fit in all of this?
Well, when you talk about resolving offenses, when somebody's hurt your feelings or they've done something terrible to you or whatever, um, and I ask people all the time, what's your definition of forgiveness and how do you know when you've truly forgiven somebody? I get
Yeah,
back some very incomplete answers to those questions. And most people have a definition of forgiveness that's going to hold up for in certain circumstances, but when you really put it to the test, it falls apart. So you hear people say things like, I thought I forgave that person, but now I'm all bitter towards them again. I must not have truly forgiven them. You know, what's the answer to that? Well, you learn that in
yeah,
a seminar. And people say,
yeah, yeah. Nice,
well, I
nice
don't think
plug.
you really forgave. Yeah.
Yeah,
Say, I don't
nice
think you
plug.
really forgave me. And the other person says, well, yeah,
Yeah,
I did. Well, no, you didn't. Well, yeah, I did. Well, no, you didn't. What's wrong with that conversation? We have
yeah,
two different definitions of forgiveness, and they're both probably insufficient.
yeah.
So, you know, uh, and believe me, there's a lot of garbage out there going around about forgiveness right now, especially in the field of psychology. You know, there's one woman out there that's saying you can forgive percentages. In other words, I can forgive my husband for having an affair. I can't forgive him for having an affair with my best friend. So I'm just going to
Yeah.
forgive him for 90%. Well, I'm
Yeah.
so glad that
Can't
there's no
be.
research to back up something idiotic like that. And it's certainly not
Well,
biblical because how much
yeah,
bitterness are we
there you go.
allowed to have as a Christian, right?
Yeah, there you go.
So,
Doesn't match up
so,
with that. Okay, so we've gotten two of the three major issues in terms of conflict resolution. What would you say is another one? And I'm again, I'm not trying to unfold the entire because I'm gonna give you the plug here to
okay.
when's the next conference, when's the next seminar, or take the course. Um, but what would be a third overarching thing that you can convict me of again that that I ought to be looking at for conflict resolution? This has been greatly eye opening. I'm loving this.
Well, Simple negotiation. How do you conduct a simple negotiation?
Great point.
There's some basic principles. One is the abundance mentality. When you think about it, here's a point of disagreement, and here's a point of disagreement. How many potential points of agreement exist between those two points of disagreement? How many, Mark? You remember your plane geometry? There's an infinite number of points between 2 points. It appears to be a straight line. That's
yes.
the definition of straight line in plane
I was taking
geometry.
your 2. Yeah.
So people sit there and they go, my point, my point, my point, my point, my point, my point, when there's an infinite number of ways to resolve that. So are we looking for the perfect solution? No, because if we're looking for the perfect solution amid infinity, we're going to be here for a long time. We're not even looking for the best solution. We're just looking for a point on the line that we can both be okay with and move forward with and test to see if it's a good solution or not. And if it's not, guess what? We have another infinite number of points that we can select from on the line somewhere and try again. So the spirit of continuously, seeking to find a solution rather than trying to argue a point is a very basic principle of negotiating. The other thing
that also says you got to come to the conversation willing to find a point, which now comes back to, you got to own this. Am I willing to come to the conversation to not argue my point, but to try to, what do you want out of this? Well, if I want resolution, we got to find some common ground here, a place that we can resolve together.
Right. Some people don't want to, they're in a power position and they don't want to give up power by resolving conflict. So, that fits under the huge category that I go over early in the course about all the reasons people don't resolve conflict. Power dynamics of relationships. If I can hold an offense toward you, it kind of keeps you one down. So I can kind of hold it over your head. So people,
which benefits no one.
Right. People have these kind of power dynamics and control dynamics that make conflict resolution impossible. Another point about negotiation is, I married my wife because she had a point. If she hadn't had a point, I don't think I'd have married her. So what sense does it make for me to spend the rest of my life making my wife prove her point? I just assume when she opens her mouth, she's got a point. And that's the principle of assumed value. I assume that in whatever you say, there's something in there of value that I can pivot off of and that we can begin to find a place of agreement. If you can't find that common value, then how can you ever resolve negotiation in a win-win place? So
and that's the win-win. That's, now you're talking the language that says we're both coming to the table not to continue this, but to find that ground where we both win in this. What's the compromise where we can both walk away from this and say we're good? And I love the fact that then you go test it to make sure that it's going to hold. That's really significant, especially in those relationships. So if I'm a pastor, I know, number one, I'm going to be in conflict a lot. Conflict resolution, to know the principles, to know the ideas, to practice it, that's of an immense value. If I'm a leader in a company, I'm going to have conflict. To know that is of immense value. If I'm in a marriage, conflict is going to occur. You've already given me 3 principles that inherent in my relationship with my wife, but now that I know them, they become they become obvious, and things that I can actually practice. This is significant, and it's significant for the leader, for the pastor, for the neighbor, for the friend, for the spouse. So given that, you're going to be teaching this as a part of the seminary. So if you're not enrolled at Grace School of Theology, you ought to get enrolled at Grace School of Theology and take this course, because this is a course that's of benefit. If you're not enrolled in Grace School of Theology. Are you teaching the seminar? Now, you did it once through Grace Center for Spiritual Development here. Are you teaching it at any other times, any other places? Can you share us where that might be, and we can at least open the door to send people?
Well, Mark, basically I have poor organizational skills. so for me to pull everything together and do a seminar is like, I can do it, but it takes me a long time, which is why I like to be in partnership with Grace School of Theology, is you guys have a lot more resources. You have people who are gifted in all of those things that I'm not gifted in. And, but hopefully we're going to have this out on video at some point, available. And also, if somebody wants to call me and try to set up something at their church, I'm glad to talk to you about it. Just understand that what I do is the presentation, all the details are still in flux. So,
well, we had a great opportunity for you to do it through Grace Center here at the seminary. We certainly are going to want to get that onto video at some point in time once we have our full on-demand system up. And I'm sure in the coming year we're going to be talking about another opportunity to put this out there. Garry, I want to thank you. You've lifted the flap of the tent on conflict resolution this morning, and hopefully piqued interest in people wanting to know more. I'll say it again: if you're a student at Grace School of Theology currently, this is a course you don't want to miss because it's going to be highly beneficial across the board. If you're not a student at Grace School of Theology, keep tuned to Grace Center for Spiritual Development, because we'll be talking about when, as an event, we put this seminar on again, or when it's going to become an on-demand course that you can take through Grace Center. My guest has been Garry Kiker, a good friend, longtime friend, and I appreciate you spending some time with us this morning to give us your expertise in this area. We'll be having Grace Cafe again next week. Our guest will be Daniel Labrie, talking about all the great things going on at the school and at Grace Center for Spiritual Development. I want to thank you for joining us this morning. Share this again, because this is incredible stuff for you to take and to apply and to be part of your life there. Garry, thank you so much for joining us. We'll look forward to doing this again soon. Appreciate you, friend.
Thank
Talk
you,
to you
Mark.
soon.
God bless.